There was some misinformation about this talk. It said that Rosalie and I were doing this. I'm sorry, it's just me tonight. So you won't have her pretty face smiling, so just have to put up with mine. I'll try to smile just as well as she does. That's a challenge. So just a quick overview of the kind of things I want to talk, not necessarily in that order, but I want to cover why orchids are important for revegetation and just how orchids are survivors. I want to do some thinking about what sort of habitat is required for orchids and what's required for success. But I thought just to start with, I'd ask you as a group, what do you think are the hindrances to including orchids in restoration? Any ideas? Why isn't it happening? Sorry? Getting the plants, yes, that's on my list.
Awareness.
Awareness, yes.
They're hard and slow and need a fungus.
They're hard and slow and need a fungus, yes. All right, so. Pardon?
I think people tend to be frightened of orchids in all sorts of applications. They think orchids are difficult.
Yeah, people are frightened of orchids and think that they're difficult.
Yeah, think they're difficult, think they're hard to get hold of, hard to keep alive, hard to provide with the right conditions, that sort of thing.
Yes. Yes, so that's right. They're difficult to propagate. They're difficult to obtain the material in the first place for all of the species that you might want to include. It's hard to find suitable habitat, and just knowing which species to include, where do you start? And then once you've got them there, how do you keep them going? Or get them to the stage where they're flourishing and spreading. I've put some links to some useful videos, but the easiest ways to find those is those key words that I've got there. If you just put those words into Google, they'll take you straight there. So the first one I'm going to look at is that Minute Earth Orchids, and that's what I hope to play for you. Also, yeah, the key message is if orchids are thriving, ecological restoration has been achieved. We went to hear Chris Daniels speak at the Australian Plant Society on Thursday, and he was saying about having the platypus in the river torrents will be an indicator that they've got the health of the river right. And that's a similar thought here, that if we've got orchids established in a site, then we've got ecological restoration has happened. There's an international conference or congress held back in 2016 where they identified orchids as a flagship plant group. So there's something that people can relate to and see as important, and people value having orchids because of their variety and their interest, and because of their rarity, I guess. And so creating orchid-enhanced habitats is a priority for ecological restoration. It's not just a pipe dream, it should be what we're aiming for. So I've got this video, I'll see how we go with this.
Earth's most ubiquitous life forms tend to be generalists, species whose individuals can adapt to eating just about anything, anywhere. But the flowering plant family known as orchids have gained a global presence by being specialists, with each species customized to a very specific habitat. And behind orchids' wild variety of looks and behaviors are the same few stingy strategies. For one, while other flowering plants send their seeds off with a supply of victuals to get them growing, orchids don't. Instead, their seedlings must trick fungi into feeding them until they're old enough to photosynthesize their own food. At that point, some species start giving back, but others hoodwink their fungal partners into lifelong one-way relationships. In fact, several are so dedicated to mooching that they don't even have the ability to produce their own sugar. And many orchids also cheat their pollinators. While most flowers offer snacks to the critters who transfer their pollen, orchids orchids look and smell like flightless female wasps. But when a male tries to carry her off to mate, he catapults instead into the flower's sex organs, sometimes picking up a sticky packet of pollen. Then there's the orchid's choice of real estate. Instead of setting down roots in a patch of rich soil, and then having to waste energy competing with other plants for light and nutrients, most orchids settle in inhospitable, low-rent locations like bare bedrock, soggy bogs, or the branches of trees. Orchids have customized these miserly habits, mooching off of fungi, cheating pollinators, and choosing cheap real estate, to habitats ranging from sub-Antarctic islands to tropical rainforests. And in the process, they've blossomed into an astounding 25,000 species, most of which are specialized to live in only one particular place with its particular conditions. And their wild variety and exotic looks have not escaped our notice. During the so-called orchid delirium in 19th century England, rich aristocrats sent orchid hunters off to scour the tropics for rare, valuable finds. The hunters even sometimes torched or razed the forest behind them in a quest for exclusivity. Today, it's illegal to collect or trade wild orchids, but tens of thousands of flowers are sold on the black market each year, some for tens of thousands of dollars. And while orchid hunters themselves no longer chop down whole forests, vast swaths of prime orchid habitat are lost to deforestation each year, putting thousands of orchid species at risk of extinction. And yet, orchids' diverse splendor may actually help save them, thanks to the devotion of a global network of orchid files. In 2010, police in England stood guard around the clock to protect the country's last wild lady slipper orchid from thieves. And in Ecuador, home to some of the highest densities of orchids in the world, conservationists established rainforest reserves to save the remarkable-looking Dracula orchids. Meanwhile, Australian citizens are building fences to protect threatened spider orchids from grazing rabbits and kangaroos. And scientists in the US are breeding rare cigar orchids in the lab and planting them in their native habitat in South Florida. All to save a bunch of plants that lie, cheat, steal, and ooh, that one's pretty. Hey, Emily here. Thanks to Curtin University and the University of Western Australia for sponsoring this video. Also, special thanks to Kingsley Dixon and the rest of the folks in the Orchid Specialist Group of the IUCN's Species Survival Division for sharing their expertise with us. The Specialist Group is dedicated to helping orchidophiles around the world learn more about Earth's most diverse plant family in order to protect and restore orchids and their habitats.
So yes, so those the stringy strategies help us to understand what we're dealing with orchids. But I thought I'd show you that all of these things are real for us in our situation. So she mentioned that there's no stored energy for the seeds. So these are seeds of nodding greenwood on one of my fingers, and you can see that they are very small. And so that's one of the reasons why you can't just do re-veg. You know, we're used to collecting seed, putting it in a pot, watering it, and it grows. But these need a fungi to actually get them to germinate. And to do that artificially, we need to do it in sterile conditions. So it means growing them in agar, having laboratory conditions with no fungi or bacteria, because agar grows fungi and bacteria really well. So you have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's the big challenge of growing orchids is the sterile conditions that are needed if you're going to grow them in the laboratory. One of our members introduced orchids to a property in Mount George just by collecting seed, and he'd put it in a salt and pepper shaker with sand, and he would scatter it around his property. So that's possible, but yeah, it's
It works.
It works, yes, it can work, and in some cases that may be the most reasonable way of doing it. But that's not really my topic today. Some of the orchids depend entirely on fungi rather than on photosynthesis, and so one example is the cinnamon bells or potato orchid. These are from Kaipo forest, and the individual plants with their flowers don't have any leaves at all. There's no photosynthesis, so they're fed entirely by the fungi that are in the soil under those particular trees. Similarly with the more common hyacinth orchids, one of them there has some green on the stem, but they have no leaves. They're not relying on photosynthesis at all for feeding a very large plant that's fed entirely by the fungi. And even like this Diurus brevifolia, it's called brevifolia because it's got a small leaf. Does it show up? So you can see that leaf that comes halfway up my hand. So it's not enough of a leaf to actually grow that plant. It's required other sources. As you mentioned, cheating pollinators. So here's an example of an orchid on the left there, the bulldog donkey orchid. And on the right is a Platylobium, the obtuse angulum, the hollyleaf, a bitter pea, and they basically attract the same insects. So the orchid is bigger and more colourful, so that's where the pollinator was more likely to go first and get the seed. So in this case, there was a ring of orchids around the peas. And that brings out one of those things I mentioned that did I mention that with the ecology of those orchids, for them to be pollinated, there needs to be a source of nectar for the bees. So if the other plant's not there, the pollinators will starve. So that whole ecosystem has to work together. So you need to have the peas there for the orchids to be viable and long term. You can't just plant some orchids somewhere and hope that they'll be all right. They have to be part of that whole ecosystem. And similarly with the spider orchids, the king spider orchid, there's an example on the right of a flower that's been damaged by the male wasp. So you need to have the wasp pollinator for this orchid to propagate. But the wasp itself lays eggs on beetle larvae that live in the soil. So if the beetles aren't there, then the wasps can't survive. So the soil health, the whole ecosystem has to be functioning properly for this orchid to be able to propagate. So Emily mentioned harsh habitats. Well, here's an example. So Bevan there is photographing orchids growing in that little cleft or on the shallow soil on a rocky outcrop on the top of a cliff. And there's an example of one that's in flower there at the top. So there's not much competition in some of these sites, and that's why orchids survive in a lot of times, is that they like those marginal habitats which are too harsh for anything else. So in a sense they are often quite hardy. And somebody asked, are they easy to grow? Well, if you've got the conditions right, they are, but they don't generally cope very well with competition. There's another example of a lady's tress of spiranthes, which grows in swamp environments. So that was mentioned before. A lot of places people are draining swamps to create habitat or create sites for farming. So it's those harsh habitats which are too hard for the farmers to use, which are refuges for orchids. Orchids on tree stems was mentioned. We had to go to Tasmania to see these. There are no epiphytes growing in South Australia. They're all ground orchids, but these will germinate actually on the stem of a small tree, and
Lots
they
of water.
Hmm?
It's quite a lot of watery
yes
habitat in Tasmania.
yes. So this was
Almost all the bush.
yeah. So this yes, it's a watery habitat in Tasmania, and so this was taken in like 2nd of January, I think it was. So this is it's moist all year round where these orchids survive.
Yeah.
Emily mentioned about conserving resources. So one strategy for the fringed hair orchid is to flower first and then the leaves come later. So these flower in generally around April, and they sort of catch the ants that pollinate them. They want to flower while the ants are active, and so they get their flowering, they get their flowers pollinated, and then the leaves come later, and so the leaves have got the whole of the season to grow and gather their energy ready for the next year. Another strategy is for at the other end of the season where it's starting to dry out before the flowers come, and so the leaves are starting to senesce before the flower actually comes out. So that's the other way around it, to make use of the growing season for the leaves, but to catch the pollinators when they're active. Another strategy for the black fire orchid, or red beaks as the West Australians call them, is that they will go for years without flowering. So people say that they've had these on their property and they've never seen them flower, but then they'll have a fire event and then they'll all flower. Obviously that's when you get the seed, if you have an event like that. And that some of those are thickening up already. You can see the seed pods forming on them. Another strategy for conserving energy is they only open in, for the sun orchids, they'll only open in optimal conditions. So they open when it's warm, and they'll open for just part of the day, like from 10 o'clock till 2 or something like that. And so that means that the flower doesn't dry out at times when the insects aren't active. So it makes best use of the insects when they are available. The lifetime of orchids varies considerably. So this bearded orchid, it's a rare species of Colonis cupreus, of copper beardy, and it's thought to only live 2 or 3 years in most cases. So it needs to be able to have habitat for its seeds to spread into and germinate. So it has to keep producing new plants for the species to survive. This is a more common bearded orchid. The interesting thing about these is that I don't think you can find a plant that's not flowering. So they seem to be able to grow as a tuber and get ready, to be fed by fungi, and when they're ready to come up, they're ready to flower. So they'll only have a flowering plant. So often you'll see a plant where you'll see lots of juvenile plants around with a few of them flowering. I haven't seen that with these. If anyone has, I'd be interested. But this seems to be the case. Every beardy you see is a flowering plant. Another fairly short-lived orchid is the donkey orchid, the this one, the leopard donkey orchid. Sounds like a contradiction to have leopards and donkeys in the same name. But anyway, and this is some mapping I did with GPS at Moores Road, just up from Morialta Conservation Park. And the purple dots are where I mapped fire orchids, and the green line is where I walked looking for orchids. And so where there's no purple dots, well, there are no orchids there. So the orchids were both sides of this cleared area. So there were fire breaks along the track, along the edge of the park. But even they disappear once you get into the thick bush. So they've been outcompeted by the native vegetation in this case. And one of the things about orchids is often they're in the more open locations where they've got more sunlight, and often the tracks through national parks are the best habitat. And it seems that the disturbance regime has changed, where there used to be small animals which disturbed the site enough to create new habitats. But we've lost all the small animals now in our native veg areas, so we don't have that same disturbance regime. And sometimes, having weed control events is the best approach to producing that sort of habitat disturbance. If you have a period bone seed comes in and fills an area, and then you have a team comes in and clears it, well, you've got a kind of disturbance which can create habitat opportunity. So it's not as simple as just having native vegetation, and some of this we just don't know how to do. So the yellow dots in this case are those donkey orchids I just showed you, and they are doing very well in this disturbed site of the fire break, which is mown fairly regularly, or slashed. Probably not mown. Mown implies a bit shorter, but they slashed that, and the critical thing with if you have a slashing regime, they have to allow time for the orchids to set seed before the slashing happens. And I've heard that with national parks, if they delay the slashing, the walkers will complain to national parks and say, "Oh, you haven't cut the fire breaks. There's a fire danger," and so they're under pressure to get these cut earlier than they should be for the sake of the orchids. And somebody from Parks was saying, well, they want to get a contractor and pay them to do the whole lot at once, so they don't want a complicated system of how they time the slashing. They want to get it all done at once, and so
Doesn't sound like conservation, it sounds
No.
like
well, that's right. So
park,
somebody said, well, why call it a conservation park if you're going to cut the fire breaks before the orchids have set seed? So yeah, so that's sort of an interesting insight to how the kind of disturbance that orchids need. So they didn't extend much beyond the fire break into this neighbouring bush. So basically they were setting the seed in the fire break area. Some seed would blow into the adjacent bushland and produce new plants, but basically they were relying on the fire break for that more consistent sustainable habitat. So the big question is if orchids had been present in a site, what's changed? Because you don't want to go thinking, oh, I can put orchids in this site if you don't know what happened to stop them being there in the first place. Weed invasion is an obvious cause of orchids disappearing from a site. but overcrowding of native plants can do the same thing. Weeds also tend to result in higher nutrient levels in soils, and when you've got higher nutrient levels, it's more suitable for introduced fungi, and the introduced fungi will compete with the native fungi that the orchids need. So the pollinators may not be present because, like I said, their food source might have gone, or they might be competing with feral bees. So feral bees could be getting the nectar before the native bees can get it. So it can get more complicated. So the grazing regime, if there's too much grazing and the plants can't set seed, in the past flower picking was a big issue with orchids. People used to be, we've had events where we've gone to a show and older people say, oh, I remember when we were younger, we pick handfuls of them and bring them home. And so
What could possibly go wrong?
what could possibly go wrong, yes. So that doesn't tend to happen now. We do hear stories of people picking the odd plant, but if they pick the flowers, well, they don't set the seed, and there's no next generation. Similarly, fire regime can stop plants flowering, or it can reduce the fungi. If the fires burn too often, then the soil doesn't build up that same nutrient level that the fungi need to be able to feed the orchids. Herbicides, I guess one of the main problems is how do you control bridal creeper in a site without spraying the orchids? So sometimes the cure can be the problem, but sometimes you have to be tough with spraying. Sometimes it's better to lose some orchids and get rid of a threat, and just removing a threat can provide an opening where native plants and orchids can populate that cleared area. Trampling is obviously a problem. Like a lot of sites in the Adelaide Hills have been not just human trampling, but cattle or sheep with their hard hooves have trampled orchids and made it difficult for them. So a regime where planting a forest nearby can change the hydrology of a site, and so a site where there were orchids relying on swamp conditions might not be there anymore when they plant a pine forest next to it. Climate change, well, obviously if you go south, there are some orchids which occur in the cooler climates, and if the climate change moves those climate regimes to the south, well, orchids will become less viable. And I mentioned before the lack of small animals for that disturbances. And in some places that people have done brush cutting to create habitat, but it's no foolproof method though. They did some slashing on the Fleurieu Peninsula where there was a site where there was a leek orchid that was threatened, and they had great success in getting a great number of flowers to come up after they did it, but then the water rats found them and they wiped them out. So there's no simple solutions. So creating habitat. So this is a site at Flagstaff Hill where I killed some pine trees, and those what look like little white flowers are Thelmitra rubra, and there were hundreds of them came up after opening up the allowing more light in there. But since then, the Oxalis purpurea has filled those sites, and so there's hardly any of the orchids now. so it's easy to get a flush of orchids, but to be able to keep them, you've got to have done the other weed control first. You've got to get the bulbs under control before you create an opening, because the bulbs and the other weeds will compete. So this is in Cara Park at Flagstaff Hill, and most of the yellow dots are where all the orchids are, or similarly on the others. You can see there was a change. And what happened at that site was we removed bone seed. So there was a chest to shoulder high bone seed across the whole park, and we used brush cutters with blades and removed them, and then we'd been spraying bridal creeper over the years and the sour sops, and that's created openings, and just by spraying the weeds, those orchids have filled those spaces. This is a site at Aberfoyle Park where we removed olives, and you can see olives in the background, and that's the neighbour's property. But all of this area under the trees was full of head-high or taller olives. And when we removed them from this site, we didn't allow the weeds to fill in the space. So we just, we'd mark all the native plants with pin marks, and we sprayed around them, and we just didn't allow the weeds to come back. And so that's now an area of native grass. And we did have a time where we actually planted some greenwoods in there, but the tree cover has increased since then, and it's not suitable any longer, partly because of the way that site was changing. So with the orchids, they need to have lots of opportunities to move into and populate new areas. I often talk about daisy weeds. So if you've got things like flatweeds or ox tongue, you can't just clear a small area of those, because if you weed out an area of daisy weeds, they blow in from around them and they fill that space. You have to get rid of the whole. You have to clean the whole site of daisy weeds before you can get a small area. So weedy grasses are better. You're better off leaving the oats and belt grass than to allow the weedy grasses to come in. Or, sorry, the daisies. So thistles and flatweeds, cat's ears. Those are bad news for orchids, because you just can't control them if you've got a big area. So you have to, I guess we've talked about it, whether you can make a buffer around areas, if you can have windbreaks which stop seeds blowing in. It may be possible to have areas that you can clean up and have suitable for orchid habitat. So bulbweeds, so this, I don't know if you can see them there, but there's lots of tiny thin leaves of thread iris, and that's just about taken over that site. So yeah, orchids don't grow with thread iris, or if you've got those bulbweeds, Sparaxis, Cape Tulip, you won't have orchids there for very long. Even soursop's, there's one site at Para Woodlands where Caladinia latifolia are growing in an area of soursop, which is quite surprising. And we're trying to treat the soursop by finding, searching very carefully, finding all of the orchids, marking each orchid before we have a go at treating the soursops, trying to selectively spot spray the soursops without wiping out the orchids. So you don't do that in 1 year. You've got to be very careful. But if you've got a site with thread iris or bulbweeds, you have to be able to get them under control. So I guess one of the principles about orchids, it's a lot easier to keep the ones you've got than to try and get them introduced to new sites. But equally, they're restricted in the number of places where they are, so there is a need to get into new sites. And if we have climate change, we will need to be able to populate new areas because the ones that have been suitable won't be in the future. Oh, so here's one of those terrible lists of, but this might be of interest to some people that, you know, the kind of, this is a summary I put together today, some of the requirements for including orchids in restoration. So you need the right kind of soil, light conditions. So likes of those fire orchids and the fringed hair orchids are orchids which grow in sandy habitats. Others, like the rufous hoods, tend to be at the other extreme, the very clay-rich soils where they can often be so hard and dry that nothing else grows there apart from those orchids. So lack of competition both from weeds and native plants. They need to have light. They obviously have to have enough nutrients in the soil to keep going, but more nutrients tend to favour other plants than the orchids. Reliable landholders. There's an orchid conservation group in Victoria, and they have a policy where they are growing orchids for conservation, rare orchids. They won't plant them in national parks managed by government because the managers change too often, and they can't rely on having access or having the same management regime for more than a couple of years because staff keep changing. So they do all of their propagation, all of their reintroductions are on private land just because of reliability. And it is a real issue. Yeah, ranges change very frequently in national parks. So you need to have the right mycorrhizal fungi or to be able to introduce it with the plants themselves. So if you plant a spider orchid, presumably the pot that has if it's got an orchid growing in it, it's also got the right fungus growing in it. As I mentioned, pollinators, you need to have the pollinator insects have to be there and their food supplies, and that ecosystem that supports them needs to be working. Information on which species are suitable, that's a big issue, and that's where citizen science comes into that. As we learn more about what the habitat requirements are for each kind of orchid, how much light do they need, what sort of soil, what grows together, all of those things we don't have a lot of information on that. Obviously, you need a source of orchids. So there's a small population of orchids that have been collected back when it was legal to do that without permits. But there's basically the rules for collecting orchids, as far as I can see, are the same for any other plant. So you can get permits for seed collecting, and so it's the same process. We haven't got to that stage yet because we haven't got to the stage of having the propagation facilities up and running sufficiently to be able to start formally collecting seed. But that in the Native Orchid Society, that's where we're hoping to get to. And the big need for orchids is room to colonise. They need to have space where you can plant them in one site, but they need room to be able to, for their seed to blow into new sites and to be able fill those spaces as well. One of the issues we've had with people having orchids on their sites is that they want to be able to fence off areas and protect them. Well, that might work for a little while, but habitats keep changing from the orchid's perspective, and they need to have room for the seed to blow into somewhere nearby. I was at Aldinga Conservation Park one time, and I asked, well, what's this ring of red flagging tape for? And they said, oh, there used to be a population of Salamitra rubra here, and they're not there now. I thought, oh, I've walked through and I saw a population about that size somewhere else. And that's the kind of thing that you need. There needs to be space for orchids to be able to find new habitat and repopulate. So just to sort of summarise that orchids are survivors, but and they do need some sort of disturbance regime that sort of matches how long each plant lives. Weeds compete for disturbed sites. If you have a disturbance that suits the orchids, well, it's also going to suit weeds. So you can't allow weeds in the vicinity of orchids if they're going to have opportunity to colonise new sites. Annual weeds can be very difficult to control, so a lot of our bush care efforts are focused on woody weeds, and we start at the top, the biggest weeds, and work the way down, but often by the time we get to the tiny weeds, the annual grasses, Poa annua or something like that, they've taken hold. And so you can't just ignore those small weeds as you're going through the process. You have to treat all weeds as they come up. So just like with that site where we removed the olives, we didn't let the small weeds come in because they degrade the site just as much. And there are times where I think, oh, there's so much oxtongue in this area that they'd be better off letting the Watsonia come back and leave it for 20 years and start again. They've got more chance of, it's easier to treat. The Watsonia can outcompete the daisy weeds, but once they're in a big area, you just can't do anything. So thinking of wind-blown seeds is a big issue. And I haven't mentioned the whole issue of paths. A lot of our bush care work in our business, we concentrate on footpaths because that's where people walk and that's where that spreads the weeds. So you have to control the weeds on the footpaths. It looks like there's no habitat there, but that's where the bush carers walk to get to their sites. And if they're on their shoes, they walk the seeds into the bushland areas. So keeping the paths clean is really important. They're not sort of outside the re-veg area. They're not insignificant. Their top priority is getting the paths clean. Anyway, that's sort of a brief summary. Not as long as our last one. And there's a couple of videos. Well, the first one is the video I just showed you, and there's a couple of the citizen science ones as well that you might find interesting. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert.